Great work today, you guys, out foraging at the Hartman Theater. I want to just follow up and talk a little bit about the writing assignment that's going to be associated with this. I know we didn't get a chance to look at our Moodle site together, but I want to share screen with you right now and show you what I have going on our Moodle page. So the laminated handout that was given showing you the experimental design, that's in the front part of the lab manual portion of this module for optimal foraging. If you were to go down the Moodle page and find the optimal foraging section and click on the overview page, it's going to bring you to this. And this is going to, kind of walk you through some background information. It's also going to give you an opportunity if you missed it or couldn't participate in person today. I've put clips of videos of us doing this in a nicer season where you'd be able to kind of take a look and see what it is that everybody was up to today in the theater. Next week, we're going to meet on Zoom. We're going to do some data analysis. We're going to evaluate whether or not there was a difference in mean number of chips per forager, mean calories per chip across the trials. We're going to see if those stressors were different, if foragers were impacted differently. So we're going to actually do a chi-square test and an ANOVA, and we're going to calculate a couple of means and graph them, and those will be what you guys need for your results section. So we'll do that together. You'll be pretty much have most of the content you need for your results section after we Zoom next week. Okay, so I wanted to let you know that we've got halfway down that Moodle page, we've got a chi-square table. I'll talk about that next time we meet. I've got a data set that I'm going to post. We'll update it with the data that we had from today. And this is a video that I had put in there of how to do the data analysis, but I'll be Zooming again with you in real time, okay? There is a rubric for the complete lab report right here. I'm going to show you that in a second. The part 1 of the lab report is what is assigned right now. That's the introduction and the method section. The part 2 is the results, discussion, and abstract. And so you can access all of them there. I also wanted to let you know, in your introduction section, in your discussion section of a lab report, you need to have literature. You need to have gone to Google Scholar. You need to have found sources, read through them, and brought in some paraphrase statements that provide support for your findings or for the background information. So specifically, I went through and I found some good articles. I picked random animals, and that's probably what you're going to want to do. Maybe look for chipmunks, things that you're comfortable with, foxes, coyotes, wolves, owls, right? Think of them either as predators or competitors, or just how they're foraging, and think about that as you're in Google Scholar and putting your search terms in there. So, for example, coyote diets in the desert, evidence for optimal foraging. Foraging of forest birds, diet, habitat structure, and search tactics. Okay, so these are general optimal foraging things. Selection of nuts by gray squirrels and optimal foraging theory. So if we're looking for basic info, things that we can pull for optimal foraging in general, those would probably be pretty good. Patch by gray squirrels and optimal foraging, same deal, okay? When we get over here, comparative feeding habits of red foxes and gray foxes. These are two competing organisms. That might be a good article to start looking at competition, okay? A hint would be to go to that article's literature cited and look for other sources. Maybe you can pull from there, or look for search terms that can help grow a more recent search for newer articles, okay? Here, diet content of mule deer, moose, elk, in the snow in winter. So we're talking about ungulates. We're talking about organisms like deer and moose, right? And how they're moving and trying to feed in the wintertime, okay? And so that for the abiotic, non-living factor. So, deep snow, rain, cold temperatures, you simulated it with your sock in 30 seconds instead of 1 minute. You'll be able to draw maybe from that article or an article similar to it that deals with colder temperatures and organisms foraging or snow and organisms foraging. And strategy of the pygmy owl while hunting avian and mammalian prey. If you're looking for an example for predation, that might be an article that you could pull from. Now, when we're doing our scientific writing, do not want you to be using quotes, okay? Paraphrase, put it in your own words, read it, put it in your own words, internally cite with, at the end of that sentence, the author's last name and year, okay? That's the way that we should be working in the lab reports from here on out, okay? So I wanted you to see that there are some starting points for you in terms of the literature that you'll need as you begin writing your introduction. But that's not all. I mean, you can go into Google Scholar and look on your own, okay? So let's take a look at the complete report rubric. I have that over here. I'm going to bring it over. It's at the very end of the lab manual module for this, okay? And what you'll notice is that we have point allotments, okay? So this is what we're grading based on. So you probably want to put a title on there, make it something a little informative, not just optimal foraging simulation. You know, we looked at biotic factors. We looked at abiotic factors. The biotic factors were competitors, predators, scavengers. And the abiotic factors were the winter weather, the harsh weather, right? So you could say that the title could involve something specific like, evaluating foraging strategies under abiotic and biotic stressors, something along those lines, something with a little more detail. The abstract section, again, that's the summary section. We skip that. We save that until the very end. We have to wait until all the other sections are done before we'll write that. Now, the introduction. So here's some of the content that we want in the introduction, okay? Basically, we want to start off by talking about optimal foraging. Okay, that's how I'd like for you to start it off. Introduction goes broad and then tapers down into something more specific, like your hypothesis. The first thing I'd like for you to start off with is telling me what optimal foraging is, okay? And there is an article at the top of that overview page of Moodle that draws you into the MacArthur and Pianka 1966, I think it is, article. That's one of the first places where that term is actually used, that theory is mentioned. Tell me what it is, right? We talked about, energy intake versus outtake and developing strategies so that you can maximize it, right? So talk about optimal foraging broadly, bring in literature, right? Maybe that one in particular would be a good one. And then talk about the strategies, right? Strategies that these organisms will take. Think about what you did, the decisions you made on the landscape as you were foraging in your plot, right? Were you a generalist? Were you more of a specialist? Those are strategies. If you were a specialist, maybe you only picked one color. If you were a generalist, you picked whatever was around you. Okay, maybe that changed depending on what your trial was. Okay, broadly talk about those two strategies, generalists and specialists. Okay, also, what makes a good forager? What makes a forager efficient? Think about a predator, right? Predator's going after its prey. It doesn't want to have to spend a ton of time finding it. So if it wants to be more efficient as a predator, it should reduce its search time. It should also reduce its travel time, okay? And so those are all things that we need to consider in terms of strategy. To reduce a search time, you should get really good at finding it. If you're really good at finding something, then you're probably a specialist because you encounter it an awful lot. Once you've encountered the food, you need to process it. You need to be able to handle it, right? Think about a squirrel with an acorn, okay? If acorns are their favorite food, they're going to get really good at popping the top cap off of that acorn, right? And processing it and eating it well. They're going to get really efficient at it. But if they're not a specialist, specializing in acorns, they might be more of a generalist. They're not going to be as good at generalists. They're not going to be as good at reducing handling time. They're going to have high handling time because they have to process a bunch of different foods. Specialists reduce their handling time, their processing time. Travel time would be reduced if you were a generalist because you can just pick up whatever food is around you, right? Search time might be reduced in that same way because you don't have to really search. It's all right there. Search time can also be reduced, as I mentioned, with a specialist because you get used to finding that same food. You get a good search image. So those are all things you need to think about. Travel time, search time, handling time. Are they reduced? Are they extended during certain strategies, right? Those would all be good, background information for you to kind of pop into the introduction section when you're talking about these strategies and optimal foraging strategies. Adaptations evolved to make you better at dealing with these stressors in the environment, like predators, competitors, scavengers, and environmental conditions that are rough. Okay. It makes sense now from going broad about these strategies and what optimal foraging is. It makes sense to jump down in the introduction to a whole paragraph devoted to biotic factors and how biotic factors influence foraging. This is where you would go to articles that cover competition, articles that cover predation, scavenging, disease, right? Think about one example organism, look for that search term, predation, right? Competition, along with this other organism's name, and give it a search in Google Scholar. See what you can find. The example I gave is with the article that I've posted with the foxes, gray and red foxes. You would think that they would compete, right? Well, that article speaks to dietary analysis, right? They do stomach content analysis. They determine that one might eat more meat or berries, insects. The other one might eat more herbaceous stuff or more woody plants. So one is more kind of herbivorous and one is a little bit more varied in their diet, okay? So they really maybe aren't competing as much, but they're because they are kind of coexisting, they are altering their feeding strategy. Maybe they would have normally eaten all the same stuff, but because they're competing, they're shifting their diets apart from one another to reduce competition. Predation, okay? If predators are on the scene, remember the example in general ecology lecture where we talked about moonlight and the mice and the owls, right? That's predation on the owls. Did the owls go out in the open when we had full moonlight, full predators? No. They waited and changed their timing of feeding and activity when predators were around. That's their strategy. They don't want to die, right? So they're going to avoid it. Tell us what these articles did, what the researchers did. Tell us what they found. Put it in your own words, and at the end of the sentence, author, comma, year. Okay. But we want to have a paragraph that talks broadly about some examples of how biotic factors, competitors, predators, scavengers, those sorts of things have altered how an organism feeds. Okay, and you're bringing in literature to find support and show us that. The next paragraph should be similar, but be about abiotic factors. Abiotic factors like harsh weather, rough temperatures, and rain, things like that, have altered how organisms feed. Okay, look for articles that talk about maybe a songbird foraging in the winter, right? Songbirds foraging in the winter. See how they alter their behavior, right? Maybe they become group foragers. Maybe they only go out during certain times. Maybe they forage more in the forest where it might be buffered from the wind, right? Look to articles like that. Tell us what they did, tell us what they found, and internally cite with the author, last name, comma, year, okay? So once you've done, your broad overview on optimal foraging, once you've got your sections in there, your paragraphs in there on abiotic factors and biotic factors influencing foraging, now you're going to taper down to a hypothesis, okay? Your final paragraph is going to kind of largely focus on the hypothesis. I always like to lead it out by reminding the reader of the goal of the experiment, right? Goal of your procedure that you did today. And then I usually do one sentence that kind of summarizes what you did, that you evaluated, 7 stressors or 6 stressors, and how, and you did this using poker chip simulation on feeding, and evaluated how these organisms altered their strategies and influenced caloric intake. Okay, so one sentence about specifics, but it's got to just be one sentence. So it can't be very detailed, right, on what the experimental design type was. Okay, so goal, broad experimental design, and then your hypothesis. Which of your trials did you expect would have yielded the highest calories? Which of your trials do you expect yielded the lowest calories? Okay, so that's your intro. Broad optimal foraging stuff, generalist, specialist, travel time, search time, handling time, paragraph on your optimal foraging or foraging influenced by abiotic factors, another one, how it's foraging is influenced by biotic factors, and then tapering down to your goal paragraph, goal, experimental design, hypothesis statement, all in one paragraph, right at the very bottom of the intro. Now we move into the materials section, materials and methods, really just methods. We don't ever have a laundry list of materials, right? We don't do that. What I would start with always is where and when did it happen, okay? Where and when did this happen? So the date, the time, the year, and that it happened over in Hartman Gym, right? Hartman Theater. A narrative on the experimental design. So somebody's going to be able to recreate this experiment based on what you have just experienced, okay? You don't want to verbatim copy paste my details, but you want to put it in your own words, okay? The first thing you need to do is you need to tell them that you made an arena, right? A foraging arena. How big was it? And that there was a safe zone. Then you're going to talk about your baggie of chips that you broadcast through the middle, right? What was the content of the baggie? What were those ratios, if you remember, right? Then you want to talk about your simulations, right? But you don't want to necessarily have 2 pages worth of details on these simulations. Speak broadly in kind of summary that normally it's 1 minute that you forage. There's some differences across all of the trials. Typically, you want to pull 2 chips. When stress increases, you end up pulling 1 chip. When you're really cold, it's 30 seconds instead of the 1 minute, and you wear the sock on your hand. When there's predation around, give the subtle details about getting hit, dropping, counting to 10, going back and foraging again. Okay, so any subtle nuance you want to devote a sentence or 2 to, but you don't want to have to copy and paste and have all the details that I put in there for each of those trials. Okay. Once that experimental design is taken care of, you need to have a small paragraph about data analysis, which again, we haven't done yet. We're going to do that next week. So it'll be even more clear then. But the handout that I gave you today that has kind of what we're going to be doing next week speaks to the idea that we're going to be calculating mean calories per chip and mean calories per forager for each of the trials. We're going to then compare that to see if there's a difference in the means across the trials using an ANOVA test, so a statistical test. Then we're also going to look at chi-square, right? We're going to do a chi-square analysis to determine if the observed chips we got, the numbers of whites, blues, and reds varies versus the expecteds, right? Which is the ratio we saw on the baggie. And if we don't see a big, huge difference, then we have to support our null hypothesis, which is that the observed number of chips equals the expected number of chips, or that we foraged randomly, okay? The alternative hypothesis, so if our value, our chi-square value is greater than our critical value, if it's way greater, we reject that null hypothesis of observed equals expected chips in favor of an alternative hypothesis that you must have evolved some sort of a strategy, had some adaptation, a behavioral change that allowed you to eat differently than what is found on the landscape. And that's an optimal foraging strategy. And so you're going to go trial by trial, evaluate that chi-square, determine if you were foraging randomly or foraging according to optimal foraging strategies. And that's kind of really where the take home is going to come in terms of writing up and kind of discussing the later part of the work. But broadly, you're going to just talk about, what graphs you made, what calculations you did, what statistics you ran in a brief, 3 or 4 sentence statement. And that's going to be the conclusion part on the end of your methods section. Okay, so methods, where and when, experimental design, data analysis. Intro is going to have your background stuff on optimal foraging, the generalist strategies and specialist strategies, the how handling travel and search times are influenced, broadly abiotic factors influencing foraging, broadly biotic factors influencing foraging, and then ending with the goal overview of the experimental design very briefly, and your hypothesis on which of those trials has the highest and lowest calories in your prediction. So I know we just did it, right? But I want you to think about like back to the very beginning before you even ran it and had a sense of how it might play out. Which one did you predict would have been? Okay, so you're going to write that up in a Word document. Just the intro, just the methods, drop it in the Dropbox for next week, midnight next week on Wednesday, the day that we have our lab. And then after we have our Zoom next week, where we do data analysis, the rest of the lab report will be due a week from that time. So the results, discussion, and abstract will be due a week from our data analysis day. So there's no need to worry about that part. Just focus on intro and methods. And again, refer to the section that I've, posted, right? I've got at the very bottom of our optimal foraging overview page, I've got, a little bit of background information, but then very bottom, I put together a listing of some articles that might help you out in some of those sections as you're beginning to write. And you can always revert back and look at the literature cited in those articles to see if there's going to be any other new one that you could go and investigate and read and paraphrase and bring in as well. Okay. If you have any questions, let me know. I might send out a reminder email about all of this stuff, but I'm going to send you this video as well. Okay. Good work today, you guys. Bye.